Today we're going to cover Chapter 4 of Edward Bernays' Propaganda. If you want to follow along, you can go to my website at howtoeatanelephant.xyz, or of course just watch the video. If you're following along, you can see that my notes are in blue, and the orange and yellow highlights are what I denote as important and very important. Bernays begins, quote, "The systematic study of mass psychology revealed to students the potentialities of invisible government of society by manipulation of the motives which actuate men in a group." Trotter and Le Bon, who approached the subject in a scientific manner, with Graham Wallas, Walter Lippmann, and others who continued with searching studies of the group mind, established that the group has mental characteristics distinct from those of the individual, and is motivated by impulses and emotions which cannot be explained on the basis of what we know of individual psychology. So the question naturally arose, if we understand the mechanism and the motives of the group mind, is it not possible to control and regiment the masses according to our will without their knowing it? The recent practice of propaganda has proved that it is possible, at least up to a certain point and within certain limits. Mass psychology is, as yet, far from being an exact science, but the mysteries of human motivation are by no means all revealed. But at least the theory and practice have combined with sufficient success to permit us to know that in certain cases we can effect some change in public opinion with a fair degree of accuracy, by operating a certain mechanism, just as the motorist can regulate the speed of his car by manipulating the flow of gasoline. Now again, he starts off very clearly saying that it is possible to control and regiment the masses according to our will, his will, without their knowing. Again, I don't know how much more sinister you can get where you're explicitly stating that you are going to manipulate people without them knowing it. And somewhat interesting is he mentions Walter Lippmann directly again, and a few other, Trotter, Le Bon, and Graham Wallas, as scientists who were studying propaganda, the mass psychology propaganda. Though he does say that it is not an exact science, as of yet. And we got to remember, this is 100 years ago, so imagine how much more refined these techniques have become after 100 years of study and honing. Now, I note here that he doesn't say it directly, but what he is alluding to here is cybernetics. I know that word gets used these days in relation to like the internet and technology and things of this nature. But it actually means something like, it comes from the Greek word kybernesis, which is something like a system of control or something like that. There's a really good book on it, not light at all, from Norbert Wiener called Cybernetics. He wrote a few other books. God and Gollum Incorporated is a little more approachable for the layperson. Cybernetics itself is a fairly steep mathematical work. And some of the things in that book are absolutely disgusting, how they did experiments on animals, nervous systems, and things of this nature. But in the end, the result is how to model man as a machine. And in this case, Bernays says we can regulate the people, the masses, through our propaganda in such the same way that a motorist can regulate the speed of his car by manipulating the flow of gasoline. You can kind of think about it in black box terms. Like imagine you have society and you can sort of push their buttons or pull their chains or yank their chains, pull the strings, etc., and see which way society moves. And you simply try this over and over again to see what results you have. And again, like I said, after 100 years, they know what buttons to push to get us to either roll over or protest, right? How many times have we seen protests break out against this one thing, but not another thing that might be objectively worse? It's because the television didn't tell us to. Think back a few years ago, we had the Black Lives Matter protests. And before that, there was some football players taking a knee during the national anthem. And for a while, people said, we're going to boycott the NFL. And that was a big story in the news. And then all of a sudden, after maybe a month or two, the news story stopped being covered and people went back to watching the NFL. I hate to say it, but most people simply do whatever the television or nowadays social media tells them to do. Bernays continues that, quote, propaganda is not a science in the laboratory sense, but it is no longer entirely the empirical affair that it was before the advent of the study of mass psychology. It is now scientific in the sense that it seeks to base its operations upon definite knowledge drawn from direct observation of the group mind, and upon the application of principles which have been demonstrated to be consistent and relatively constant. The modern propagandist studies systemically and objectively the material with which he is working in the spirit of the laboratory. If the matter in hand is a nationwide sales campaign, he studies the field by means of a clipping service or a corps of scouts, or by personal study at a crucial spot. He determines, for example, which features of a product are losing their public appeal, and in what new direction the public taste is veering. He will not fail to investigate to what extent it is his wife has the final word in the choice of her husband's car, or his suits, or his shirts. Here, again, we don't really know why he's talking out of both sides of his mouth again. He's talking about the propagandist studying the people to see which direction the public taste is veering. But like literally a few paragraphs ago, he was saying we can manipulate the people without them even knowing. So I suppose you would want to know what the people want, what their taste is, and then you can sort of nudge it in one direction or another. A few chapters ago, he said that everything you do, from the food you eat, the clothes you wear, the television shows you watch, the books you read, the jokes you laugh at, all of this is controlled by these people. So it really is a wonder why he even thinks anything of what the public taste is. If they can completely brainwash us down to what we eat and what we laugh at, what we think is acceptable morally, like who cares what our taste is? It's like asking a horse what he wants for dinner. Like you're going to give him the oats or you're going to give him the carrot. You're going to give him whatever you want to give him, and the horse is going to eat it. He has no say. You're not going to query the horse and say, hey, what do you want for dinner tonight? You don't care. He's a beast of burden. Bernays continues that, quote, propaganda, like economics and sociology, can never be an exact science for the reason that its subject matter, like theirs, deals with human beings. And I think it's just kind of a bit amusing here that we're going to compare propaganda to economics and sociology. As I say here in my notes, talk about the Three Stooges. I don't want to say economics and sociology are worthless, but boy oh boy, there's a reason they call economics the dismal science. Bernays continues, quote, if you can influence the leaders, either with or without their conscious cooperation, you automatically influence the group which they sway. But men do not need to be actually gathered together in a public meeting or in a street riot to be the subject of influences of mass psychology. Because man is by nature gregarious, he feels himself to be a member of a herd, even when he is alone in his room with his curtains drawn. His mind retains the patterns which have been stamped on it by group influences. A man that sits in his office deciding what stocks to buy, he imagines, no doubt, that he is planning his purchase according to his own judgment. In actual fact, his judgment is a melange of impressions stamped on his mind by outside influences, which unconsciously control his thought. He buys a certain railroad stock because it was in the headlines yesterday, and hence is the one which comes most prominently to his mind. Because he has a pleasant recollection of a good dinner on one of its fast trains, because of its liberal labor policy, a reputation for honesty, because he has been told that J.P. Morgan owns some of its shares. Trotter and Le Bon concluded that the group mind does not think in the strict sense of the word. In place of thoughts, it has impulses, habits, and emotions, in making up its mind, its first impulse is usually to follow the example of a trusted leader. This is one of the most firmly established principles of mass psychology. It operates in establishing the rising or diminishing prestige of a summer resort, in causing the run on a bank, or a panic in the stock exchange, in creating a bestseller or a box office success. And here we see the true, well, maybe not the total depth, but some of the seriousness that this kind of propaganda can cause. He states explicitly that you, even when you're at home alone, you're going to be swayed by these mass psychology forces. And his example is when you're buying a particular stock, you think you're buying it because of your own volition, but in reality, you've been manipulated, nudged into buying that stock. But what is most concerning here is his example is causing a run on a bank or a panic on the stock exchange. We are well beyond manipulating people to buy a particular shirt or even a particular stock. Like, this is nation destabilizing territory here. This would be considered a national security issue if someone today had the power to do this. And I guarantee they do. If the news media said that there was a shortage of dollar bills or something like that, or we've actually seen it. A year or two ago, maybe 2022-ish, there was, I believe it was Silverstone Bank, don't quote me on that, but there were a few banks that ended up going bust likely because the media said, oh, these banks are weak. People went and withdrew their money. They literally caused a bank run, and a few of these banks went under. I think then JP Morgan ended up buying them out, something like that. Again, don't quote me. I don't know this. Don't know the details off the top of my head. But now I'm also not saying that these banks were solvent in the first place. If I remember correctly, they went really long on treasuries when the interest rate was low, and then the interest rates came up, but they were stuck sort of holding the bag with these near 0% interest rate 10-year bonds when the interest rate is now 4.5%, 5%. So again, I'm not saying that the banks were solvent. I'm saying that they probably would have kind of gotten away with it if the media didn't shine that light on them. But either way, the point I'm making here is this is nation destabilizing territory. When you have the power to cause a bank run or a panic on the stock market, that is an enormous power that people should not have. I mean, whatever happened to the free market? Bernays continues, quote, "But when the example of the leader is not at hand, the herd must think for itself. It does so by means of cliches, pat words or images, which stand for a whole group of ideas or experiences. Not many years ago, it was only necessary to tag a political candidate with the word interests, to stampede millions of people into voting against him because anything associated with interests seemed necessarily corrupt. Recently, the word Bolshevik has performed a similar service for persons who wish to frighten the public away from a particular line of action." And here we see a very overt example or examples of political manipulation. The whole quote-unquote truth thing that they were talking about, how the truth was the most important and it would come to light, that goes right out the window when power is involved. People are going to clearly lie. They're saying they're tagging politicians with the word interests or Bolshevik to submarine their careers. Today, people use these almost exact same tactics, but with different catchphrases. We hear fascist, communist, neo-Nazi, boomer, snowflake, libtard, conservatard, Democrat, Republicrap, Republicant, demon rat, MAGA. It goes on and on. Now, if you ever hear or read anything that uses these words, try a simple experiment. Replace the offending term with poopy head. Does this change the meaning of the sentence? I argue that 9 times out of 10, and here I think I'm being generous, that it does not change the meaning of the message. All we hear with these terms is calling each other, kindergarten names. You're just a dummy. Now, I think that this is the this is at least some evidence that the world is sliding away from actually conversing with the other side to simply calling each other names. At this point, we can't even talk to one another, and I don't think that's going to end well. We really see the other side as bad people. When you hear, Donald Trump being called Hitler and Vladimir Putin being called Hitler, they're making this association that like Hitler was a bad guy and he was really bad, so these other people are just like him, and something terrible is going to come from this massive divide between us. Bernays continues, by playing upon an old cliche or manipulating a new one, the propagandist can sometimes swing a whole mass of group emotions. In Great Britain during the war, World War I, the evacuation hospitals came in for a considerable amount of criticism because of the summary way in which they handled their wounded. It was assumed by the public that a hospital gives prolonged and conscientious attention to its patients. When the name was changed to evacuation posts, the critical reaction vanished. No one expected more than an adequate emergency treatment from an installation so named. The cliché hospital was indelibly associated in the public mind with a certain picture. To persuade the public to discriminate between one type of hospital and another, to disassociate the cliché from the picture it evoked, would have been an impossible task. Instead, a new cliché automatically conditioned the public emotion towards these hospitals. Men are rarely aware of the real reasons which motivate their actions. A man may believe that he buys a motor car because, after careful study of the technical features of all the makes on the market, he has concluded that this is the best. He is almost certainly fooling himself. He bought it, perhaps, because a friend whose financial acumen he respects bought one last week, or because his neighbors believed that he was not able to afford the car of that class, or because its colors are those of his college fraternity. And we see here that using the words in typical propagandist fashion, you can get people to accept one type of hospital versus another simply by changing the name. And further that, he says that men are not even aware of the reasons which motivate their actions. Again, this is such deep disdain. He's saying that men do things for essentially no reason at all, or at least no reason of their own. And over the past few decades, we've seen this. Saddam Hussein ruled with an iron fist. Assad gassed his own people. Putin's war of aggression. On the other hand, we are to believe that Bernays and our leaders, also men, I think, right? I mean, he's telling us that men are not motivated by their own reasons, but our leaders are men, or maybe they're lizard people, who knows? Somehow, they act with pure reason. So Bernays and our leaders, they act with pure reason. But the people that are thinking about the hospitals in the war, or the people that are thinking about buying a car, nope, they don't think with reason. Some men do, and others don't. Maybe some men are maybe even more equal, we might say, than others. And it's always the other that acts irrationally, while the in-group, they act rationally. How many wars, as an example, how many wars has the USA been involved in since World War II? And every single time, quote unquote, we are the, quote, good guys. Every single time, we're always the good guys. We make no mistakes, no errors. In 75 odd years, we're always the good guys. Huh. What luck. Bernays continues, it is chiefly the psychologists of the school of Freud who have pointed out that many of man's thoughts and actions are compensatory substitutes for desires which he has obliged to suppress. A thing may be a desire not for its intrinsic worth or usefulness, but because he has unconsciously come to see in it a symbol of something else, the desire for which he has been ashamed to admit even to himself. A man buying a car may think he wants it for the purpose of locomotion, whereas the fact may be that he would really rather prefer not to be burdened with it, and would rather walk for the sake of his health. He may really want it because it is a symbol of social position and evidence of success in business, or a means of pleasing his wife. Now, I'm not going to go into it, but even a cursory search on something like even Google will show you that Freud is pretty much a joke by modern standards. There may be something to learn by studying him and his methods, but I don't think anyone really takes Freud seriously in 2020 and beyond. Now, this is a little bit off topic, but I want to make a point here. I thought that 100 years ago, men were like beating their wives into submission, totally and completely oppressing women. So why would a man buy a car to please his wife if this were the case? Doesn't really make sense. Shouldn't he just slap her around and tell her to go make a sandwich? Right? Isn't that how it's supposed to be? I mean, that's what the feminists tell us. Or maybe, just maybe, 100 years ago, men and women, maybe they actually got along. And the modern feminists have been propagandized for the last several decades. And I mention this specifically because it is interesting to note that, and we'll see more of this in a later chapter, Bernays actually promoted early feminist ideology. So I'm not just injecting this for no reason at all. We'll see. We come back to this. Bernays continues, quote, "It is evident that the successful propagandist must understand the true motives and not be content to accept the reasons which men give for what they do." Literally, don't listen to what someone says. The propagandist clearly knows me better than I know myself. They know you better than you know yourself. It's absolutely ridiculous. They think they know better. They think they're gods among men. It's ridiculous. I don't know how else to say it. He continues again, quote, "It is not sufficient to understand only the mechanical structure of society, the groupings and cleavages and loyalties. An engineer may know all about the cylinders and pistons of a locomotive, but unless he knows how steam behaves under pressure, he cannot make his engine run. Human desires are the steam which makes the social machine work." And we see here more mechanical analogies, that they see man as nothing but a clockwork automaton to be used and manipulated by Bernays and his ilk. Also, as I mentioned before, it sort of reveals how Bernays and propagandists and leaders see people as stupid. But this is actually beyond stupid. They're, again, clockwork automaton. Now, those are my words, but that's how he sees us, as mannequins, like totally brainless, not just stupid, actually brainless. He continues, quote, "Only by understanding them can the propagandist control the vast, loose-jointed mechanism which is modern society. The old propagandist based his work on the mechanistic reaction psychology then in vogue in our colleges. This assumed that the human mind was merely an individual machine, a system of nerves and nerve centers reacting with mechanical regularity to stimuli, like a helpless, will-less automaton. It was the special pleader's function to provide the stimulus which would cause the desired reaction in the individual purchaser. It was one of the doctrines of the reaction psychology that a certain stimulus, often repeated, would create a habit, or that the mere reiteration of an idea would create a conviction. Suppose the old type of salesmanship, acting for a meat packer, was seeking to increase the sale of bacon. It would reiterate innumerable times in full-page advertisements, "Eat more bacon. Eat bacon because it is cheap, because it is good, because it gives you reserve energy." Now, I guess I got ahead of myself a little bit here. He does use the word, the phrase, helpless, will-less automaton. So, there it is. I wasn't even putting words in his mouth. He did say that. And the part about bacon is a bit interesting as well, because before Bernays, bacon was seen as a kind of a dirty meat and not consumed much at all. And again, Bernays was hired to promote bacon. So he's not just saying this off the cuff. He literally was the guy who brought bacon to its I don't want to say it's current, but it's more acceptable and popular stance as a food. Not to say that bacon's bad. I love bacon. Who doesn't? He continues again, quote, "The newer salesmanship, understanding the group structure of society and the principles of mass psychology, would first ask, who is it that influences the eating habits of the public? The answer, obviously, is the physicians. The new salesman would then suggest to physicians to say publicly that it is wholesome to eat bacon. He knows as a mathematical certainty that large numbers of persons will follow the advice of their doctors because he understands the psychological relation of dependence of men upon their physicians. And I mentioned this in a previous chapter, but this same tactic was used by having doctors promote, in this case, cigarette sales. At least in the case of bacon, it probably is relatively healthy depending on your overall diet, but cigarettes and many other doctor-promoted products have been decidedly not healthy. Recently, I was reading an article where some modern quote-unquote dietitians, some of which were sponsored by General Mills, are now promoting this anti-diet and decrying fat shaming. What is anti-dieting anyway? Obviously, they mean to not restrict your food intake. But the definition of the word diet, which would be whatever selection of food you are eating. And this is two examples here. We see doctors, or dietitians in this case, promoting fat as healthy at any weight. And we see time and time again that these influencers that are, well, fat, they die when they're in their sometimes 30s and 40s. It happens all the time. It's sad. I'm not trying to attack them, but we can't close our eyes and be blind to the obvious that if you weigh, 400 pounds and you're 5'6", like that is not healthy in any stretch. And then one more layer of the propaganda here is the word diet. It's used today to mean, you're eating less or you're changing your diet, where again, the word diet is just whatever food you're eating. And I think this is another word that we're losing or maybe have even lost to manipulation. And I think that the future, in fact, I guarantee the future will see this anti-dieting, anti-healthy weight fad historically the same exact way we see cigarette advertisements. And I'm going to belabor this a little bit more, that doctors are for some reason seen as these great authorities on health. Now, at face value, this isn't a completely ridiculous position to take, but consider that most of the time a doctor spends treating patients. Most patients have particularly common ailments. Even a specialist doctor's patients are going to have the same ailment over and over again. So the doctor spends his time treating patients. That seems reasonable. What they don't do is spend their time keeping up with the latest advancements in their field. Now, that isn't to say that all new develops are improvements. We can certainly make mistakes when we're exploring new treatments and what have. But the doctors are not even the ones looking at the new data. They're practicing what they learned in school and will likely practice this until they retire. I wouldn't go so far to say I won't trust your doctor, but if you have a disease or some kind of an ailment, you should certainly do your own research. As I believe Reagan said, trust but verify. So maybe use the doctor as a starting off point and take his advice, certainly, but do your own research and see, has there been new developments in the field of whatever your ailment is? And I've belabored it several times in these lectures, but safe and effective, right? I think that one's going to go down as a joke for the ages. Well, maybe a gallows joke. Bernays continues, "The new salesman has found it possible, by dealing with men in the masses through their group formations, to set up psychological and emotional currents which will work for him. Instead of assaulting sales resistance by direct attack, he is interested in removing the sales resistance. He creates circumstances which will swing emotional currents as to make for the purchaser demand. If, for instance, you want to sell pianos, It is not sufficient to blanket the country with your direct appeal such as, "You, buy a Mozart piano now. It is cheap. The best artists use it. It will last you for years." What are the true reasons why the purchaser is planning to spend his money on a new car instead of a new piano? Because he has decided that he wants the commodity called locomotion more than he wants the commodity called music? Well, not altogether. He buys a car because it is at the moment the group custom to buy cars. The modern propagandist therefore sets to work to create circumstances that will modify that custom. He appeals perhaps to the home instinct, which is fundamental. He will endeavor to develop public acceptance of the idea of a music room in the home. This he may do, for example, by organizing an exhibition of period music rooms designed by well-known decorators, who themselves exert an influence on buying groups. He enhances the effectiveness and prestige of these rooms by putting in them rare and valuable tapestries. Then, in order to create a dramatic interest in the exhibit, he stages an event or a ceremony. To this ceremony, key people, persons known to be influential in the buying habits of the public, such as a famous violinist, a popular artist, and a society leader, are invited. These key persons affect other groups, lifting the idea of the music room to a place in the public consciousness which it did not have before. The juxtaposition of these leaders and the idea which they are dramatizing are then projected to the wider public through various public channels. Meanwhile, influential architects have been persuaded to make the music room an integral architectural part of their plans, with perhaps a special charming niche in one corner for a piano. Less influential architects will, as a matter of course, imitate what is being done by the men who they consider masters of their profession. They, in turn, will implant the idea of the music room in the mind of the general public. The music room will be accepted because it has been made the thing. The man or woman who has a music room or has arranged a corner of the parlor as a musical corner will naturally think of buying a piano. It will come to him as if it were his or her own idea. Now, I made this note here because, again, who cares about music rooms? But it shows the insidious nature of how they pull the strings of the public. They want to create these particular circumstances, these illusions and fashions, and each cog in this propaganda machine likely has no idea that they are part of some larger machination. They are all flattered to be invited to this event or ceremony. They are glad to be on the inside, the in crowd, if you will. And they are setting this trend because it enhances their public position, right? You want to be seen, or these influencers and celebrity types, they want to be seen as on the bleeding edge of culture. Now, the idea or product filters down to the less influential, the followers, the purchasers, or maybe even the voters. Now, I think this particular example of a music room and a piano, we can see how circuitous a path the propagandist takes to get us to buy pianos. A whole host of influencers are employed to create the circumstances, a music room, right? These dramatic events, these public events, ceremonies, inviting the violinists, talking to the architects, all of this stuff, just to sell you a piano. And if they're going to go to those extents, again, to sell you a piano or a car or whatever it might be, do you think they might go farther when more was on the line than a few $1,000s, when it was a Senate seat or a presidential candidate? Do you think they might not go to further extents to manipulate you? He continues, quote, "Under the old salesmanship, the manufacturer said to the prospective purchaser, 'Please buy a piano.' The new salesman has reversed the process and caused the prospective purchaser to say to the manufacturer, 'Please sell me a piano.'" When an attempt was made to show the public the beauty of apartments, a competition was held among interior decorators for the furnished apartments in Jackson Heights. An important committee of judges decided This competition drew the approval of well-known authorities as well as the interest of millions who were made cognizant of it through a newspaper and magazines and other publicity, with the effect of building up a definite prestige of the development. This is just another quick example where he's showing we're not selling pianos, we're showing the beauty of apartments. Now, I think most people today would think that apartments are most people would probably rather live in a house. I don't know if that's true or not, but I know I certainly would. But they maybe, and 100 years ago, apartments would have probably been even less desirable, but they're using their propaganda techniques to show the beauty of apartments, to sell the public on this idea of prestige in developments of apartments. He continues, and this is another, I think, very interesting example of both manipulating people for financial ends, but also how, again, circuitous of tactics they will take. Quote, "One of the most effective methods is utilization of the group formation of modern society in order to spread ideas. An example of this is a nationwide competition for sculptures in ivory soap, open to school children in certain age groups as well as professional sculptors. A sculptor of national reputation found ivory soap an excellent medium for sculpture. The Procter & Gamble Company offered a series of prizes for the best sculpture in white soap. The contest was held under the auspices of the Art Central in New York City, an organization of high standing in the art world. School superintendents and teachers throughout the country were glad to encourage the movement as an educational aid for schools. Practice among school children as part of their art courses was stimulated. Contests were held between schools, between school districts, and between cities. Ivory soap was adaptable for sculpting in the homes because mothers saved the shavings and the imperfect efforts for laundry purposes. The work itself was clean. In the first of these national competitions, about 500 pieces of sculpture were entered. In the third, 2,500. And in the fourth, more than 4,000. It was carefully selected pieces because they were so numerous. It is evident that a vast number were sculpted during that year, and that a much greater number must have been made for practice purposes. The goodwill was greatly enhanced by the fact that the soap had become not merely the concern of the housewife, but also a matter of personal and intimate interest to her children." Again, there's not much to say there, but they created a soap sculpting contest to ostensibly sell more soap. Do you think Procter & Gamble really cared about arts and what children were doing and what housewives were doing? They simply wanted to sell more soap. And again, if they're willing to go to those extents to sell more soap, when there's more on the line, what are these types of people willing to do? Bernays continues, "A number of familiar psychological motives were set into motion in the carrying out of this campaign. The aesthetic, the competitive, the gregarious, much of the sculpting was done in school groups, the snobbish, the impulse to follow the example of a recognized leader, the exhibitionist, and last but no means least, the maternal. All of these motives and group habits were put in concerted motion by the simple machinery of group leadership and authority. As if actuated by the pressure of a button, people began working for the client for the sake of the gratification obtained in the sculpture work itself. The point is most important in successful propaganda work. The leaders who lend their authority to any propaganda campaign will do so only if they can be made to touch their own interests. There must be a disinterested aspect of the propagandist's activities. In other words, it is one of the functions of the Public Relations Council to discover at which point his client's interests coincide with those of other individuals or groups. In the case of the soap sculpture competition, the distinguished artists and educators who sponsored the idea were glad to lend their services and their names because the competitions really promoted an interest in which they had at heart, the cultivation of the aesthetic impulse among the younger generation." So again, we can see here that the propagandist is actually manipulating multiple parties at the same time. They're trying to manipulate the group leaders and authority to carry water for them, while ultimately manipulating their final target. Here, he's manipulating the educators and artists and using that leverage to then manipulate the housewives and the students to buy more ivory soap. While someone is promoting this art competition, they might truly believe it's a good idea. And again, it might be. I'm not arguing against art or anything like that. But the real reason for concocting this entire charade is to improve the profitability of the soap manufacturer. And again, I ask, where is the truth in all of this ruse? And I think this is another reason why propaganda has gotten its well-deserved bad name. If Procter & Gamble simply set out and said, we want to sell more soap, you should buy more because you can sculpt it, it probably wouldn't work. You have to create this illusion. You have to create this gaslighting charade that you're doing good by promoting this sculpting. Bernays continues, quote, such coincidence and overlapping of interests is as infinite as the interlacing of group formations themselves. For example, a railway wishes to develop its business. The Council on Public Relations makes a survey to discover at which points of interest it coincides with those of its prospective customers. The company then establishes relations with the Chamber of Commerce's along its right-of-way and assists them in developing their communities. It helps them to secure new plants and industries for the town. It facilitates business through the dissemination of technical information. It is not merely a case of bestowing favors in the hopes of receiving favors. These activities of the railroad, besides carrying goodwill, actually promote growth in its right-of-way. The interests of the railroad and the communities through which it passes mutually interact and feed one another. In the same way, a bank institutes an investment service for the benefit of its customers in order that the latter may have more money to deposit with the bank. Or a jeweler concerned develops an insurance department to insure the jewels it sells, in order to make the purchaser feel greater security in buying jewels. Or a baking company establishes an information service suggesting recipes for bread to encourage new uses for bread in the home. I'm just noting these few passages here to again belabor this point that the propagandist tactics can be used for anything: soap, railroads, banks, literally any good or service. And they frame it as the railroad is doing you a favor, or the bank or the jeweler is doing you a favor, or the bakery in this case. But in all four examples he gives, the goal of the railroad, the bank, the jeweler, and the baker is increased profits. The railroad only is expanding because it can increase its profits. The bank wants you to take advantage of this investment where you can earn more money because they're going to earn more money. The jeweler is trying to sell you insurance, and the baker is giving you recipes so you buy more bread. None of these things are for the customer. And I also want to argue here that it's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Yes, maybe the bank is telling you about this investment. Maybe it legitimately is a good investment, and you can both win because of it. So not all of these tactics are necessarily underhanded, but they all certainly come back to profit. Bernays concludes, I have tried in these chapters to explain the place of propaganda in modern American life and something of the methods by which it operates. To tell the why, the what, the who, and the how of the invisible government which dictates our thoughts, directs our feelings, and controls our actions. In the following chapters, I shall try to show how propaganda functions in specific departments of group activity to suggest some of the further ways in which it may operate. Now again, hopefully you're starting to see how insidious this propaganda is. And again, imagine how 100 plus years of these tactics that have undoubtedly been much improved and become much more subtle, how our society has been molded by these so-called invisible government. I've mentioned terms before like deep state or even maybe Illuminati, the likes of which are linked to conspiracy theories. and I certainly can't vouch for all the conspiracy theories, but it does seem more than reasonable to conclude that there are certain interested groups that are trying to manipulate the world. It might be as simple as trying to sell more soap or to get more business to your bank or bakery, but it also might be trying to install particular world leaders who are sympathetic to your causes. In my mind pops the World Economic Forum Young Global Leaders, where Klaus Schwab himself has bragged about infiltrating cabinets with his young global leaders. Now, to what extent are they trying to manipulate us? And how successful have they been, or will they be? How much control and influence do they exert? These, I hope, are now questions of degree and not truth. As I said in the introduction, I believe the following. This is the lens by which I see the world. There exists a class of people, the so-called elite, that have wealth, power, and influence. And they work together with other wealthy, powerful, and influential people to both maintain and advance their wealth, power, and influence. Now, I hope you can see that this is not some kind of far-fetched insanity, but a much more accurate lens to view the modern world through, given what we have seen in only the first 4 chapters of the first book that I'm going to cover. And I promise you that over the coming months and maybe years, I will support my position much better. So with that, we'll finish off chapter 4. I'd like to thank you for your time and attention. If you're interested in seeing more of this, there's probably links in the description below, or you can go to my website at howtoeatanelephant.xyz. There's a donate button there that I would be not at all adverse to you using if you really like this content. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. I'll read everything and get back to everyone. And so with that, I'll say, I hope you have a good night.